The call comes in quiet, no music, no warning, just a voice on the other end asking a question nobody in Boston once answered. A priest, a child, years ago, and the line goes dead before anyone can say what it really means. Inside the Boston Globe newsroom, the city hums like it always does. Phones ringing, printers coughing out paper, reporters trading jokes that feel older than they are. This place has routines carved deep into its bones. Scandals come and go, politicians fall, sports heal everything, except this. Because this story doesn't shout, it whispers. And whispers are easy to ignore. A new editor walks in carrying the weight of an outsider. Marty Barron doesn't have the Boston accent, doesn't have the Boston loyalties. He reads everything, especially the stories people buried years ago. A small article catches his eye, a single paragraph about a priest accused of abusing children. Settled quietly, moved quietly, forgotten intentionally. Marty doesn't say much. He just asks one question that lands hard. How many? The Spotlight team is used to digging. Old-school investigative reporters, long timelines, slow burns. Walter Robinson leads them with the patience of someone who's seen truth die from neglect. Mike Rezendes has fire in his chest and frustration in his voice. Sacha Pfeiffer listens better than anyone. Matt Carroll connects dots others don't even see. They've chased powerful people before. This feels different, heavier, like touching something sacred and rotten at the same time. They start where the paper once stopped. Court documents, sealed settlements, names whispered but never printed. A lawyer named Mitchell Garabedian keeps appearing, always on the edges, always fighting alone. When they finally sit across from him, the room feels tight. His files are thick, his eyes tired. He doesn't smile. He tells them about children who trusted priests, about parents who trusted the church, about silence that lasted decades. His voice doesn't rise. It doesn't have to. The teen realizes the problem isn't one priest, or two. It's the system, the quiet transfers, the protection, the way authority closed ranks while children carried shame they didn't earn. Boston isn't just Catholic, it's built around it. Churches on every corner. Faith woven into identity. Pull this thread, and the whole city might unravel. Doors start closing. Calls go unanswered. Sources hesitate. Even inside the Globe, doubt creeps in. This investigation takes time. Time costs money. And the church doesn't look like a villain from the outside. It looks like comfort, like tradition, like home. But the files keep growing. The patterns repeat. Abuse. Transfer. Silence. Again and again and again. The truth is there now, breathing, impossible to unsee. The team understands what publishing this will do, who it will hurt, who it will anger, who will never forgive them. And still, the biggest question hangs unanswered in the air, pressing on every breath they take. How many knew and chose to stay silent? The work doesn't explode forward. It grinds. Boxes dragged from basements. Dust on fingers. Names typed into old databases that feel like graveyards. The team splits up, chasing fragments across Boston, each thread thin on its own, terrifying when woven together. Sacha sits with survivors in quiet rooms where the air feels heavy. Men now, grown, successful on paper. But the moment they speak, time collapses. Voices shake. Hands clench. They describe childhood bedrooms, church basements, hands where they never should have been. And the worst part isn't the act itself, it's what followed. Being told to stay quiet, being told it was their fault, being told God would be angry if they spoke. Mike hunts paper trails with restless energy. He pushes court clerks, argues with receptionists, slams drawers closed when records come back sealed. Every locked file feels intentional, designed. Someone wanted this buried deep. When he finally cracks one case, it opens into another, and another. Different priests. Same pattern. Abuse allegations, quiet settlements, confidentiality clauses like duct tape over screaming mouths. Matt starts mapping addresses, parish by parish. Dates overlapping in ways that shouldn't be possible if these were isolated incidents. He pins them together until the board fills up. Red strings everywhere. The visual alone makes his stomach tighten. This isn't coincidence. It's logistics. Walter watches it all with a calm that borders on dread. He's seen institutions lie before. But this one taught him how to speak, how to believe. He knows the city will fight back. He knows advertisers will panic. He knows the phones will light up with anger the moment ink hits paper. And still, he keeps saying the same thing. Slow down. Get it right. If they miss even one fact, the whole thing collapses. Pressure comes from unexpected places. Editors suggest waiting. Lawyers advise caution. The church issues carefully worded statements about past mistakes and healing. Words polished smooth, like they've been practiced for years. Marty listens, expression unreadable. He doesn't argue, he just asks for more reporting. The team tries to get comment from the archdiocese. Meetings are postponed. Emails disappear. When a church spokesperson finally responds, the answers are thin, rehearsed, defensive. No numbers, no admissions, just a repeated insistence that these were rare cases, handled appropriately, long ago. The implication is clear. Why reopen wounds? Because they never healed. A breakthrough comes quietly, a psychologist's study buried in plain sight. Lists of priests known internally as problematic. The term feels obscene in its understatement. Dozens of names, possibly more. Mike reads it twice, 3 times. His breath shortens. This document was never meant for public eyes. It confirms what they feared. Leadership knew, quantified it, managed it. Now the question isn't just how many priests, it's how high the knowledge went. As September 11 shakes the country, the story pauses. Newsrooms shift into emergency mode. Grief floods the airwaves. Patriotism, fear. The team steps back, not by choice but necessity. It feels wrong to push now. The city needs something else, but the delay eats at them. Evidence sits. Survivors wait. Silence stretches again. When they return, something has changed. The weight is heavier. The stakes clearer. They decide to aim higher. Not just individual abusers, the system itself. They push to unseal documents, file motions, argue public interest. The legal fight becomes its own battle, slow and brutal. Behind closed doors, doubts creep in. Are they strong enough to take on an institution this old, this loved, this protected? Walter doesn't say it out loud, but everyone feels it. Publishing partial truth would be safer. Less backlash, fewer enemies. But partial truth is what allowed this to happen. The evidence stacks higher. Survivor voices echo louder. The team stands at the edge of something irreversible. If they go forward, there's no retreat. No apology that can undo it. And hanging over every late night, every whispered conversation is one terrifying realization. If this is Boston, what does that mean for everywhere else? The deeper they go, the quieter everything gets. Fewer returned calls. Longer pauses before answers. People who once talked freely now glance at doors before speaking. Boston has a way of protecting its own, and the church sits at the center of that protection like stone. Sacha meets a man in a small apartment, walls bare, light dim. He's lived alone for years. He tells his story carefully, like each word costs him something. He was an altar boy, proud, trusted. When the abuse started, he didn't have language for it, only fear. When he finally told an adult, the response was swift and devastating. Don't say anything. You'll hurt the church. You'll hurt your family. The shame stayed. It shaped every relationship after. When he finishes, there's silence. Thick. He doesn't cry. That almost makes it worse. Mike pushes harder. His frustration sharpens into anger. He corners officials, challenges evasive answers. He's told to be respectful, to remember where he is. But respect is exactly what allowed this to continue. He uncovers another sealed case, then another. The repetition becomes nauseating. Different victims. Same language, same legal strategy. Confidentiality as a weapon. Matt's board fills until there's barely space left. He steps back and sees the pattern fully now. Transfers timed just right. Priests moved before complaints became public. Parishes with multiple accusations years apart, like aftershocks. He realizes this required planning. Meetings, decisions, paperwork. This wasn't neglect. It was management. Walter struggles in private. He attends Mass out of habit, sits in the pew, listens to words he's heard his entire life. Forgiveness, compassion, truth. The contradiction presses in on him. He believes in faith. But belief doesn't excuse silence. He remembers how long the Globe waited before pursuing this story seriously. The paper failed too. That thought doesn't leave him. They finally get a list. Names. Official. Real. Priest the archdiocese internally identified as abusive risks. The number is higher than anyone expected. Reading it feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. There's no pretending now. This is proof of knowledge, of awareness, of choice. Marty pushes them again. Not faster, deeper. If they're going to do this, it has to be undeniable. Survivors alone won't be enough. Documents alone won't be enough. They need both, locked together, unbreakable. Resistance intensifies. The church hires powerful attorneys. Statements grow sharper. Subtle warnings slip through conversations. This will hurt people. This will damage faith. This will divide the city. The implication hangs there. Do you really want to be responsible for that? The team answers without saying it out loud. The damage already happened. They're just shining a light on it. Another survivor comes forward. Then another. Word spreads quietly. People who've carried this alone for decades realize they aren't alone after all. Sacha listens until her voice goes hoarse, each story different in detail, identical in outcome. Silence enforced by authority. Pain absorbed by children. Mike finally breaks. Alone in the office late at night, he stares at the files and feels something crack. Rage. Grief. Disbelief that this was allowed, that it was hidden so effectively. He realizes the story isn't just about priests, it's about power protecting itself. The legal barrier finally gives way. A judge orders documents unsealed. It's a small victory, but it feels seismic. Boxes arrive, pages spill out, names repeat, dates align. The truth sharpens into something undeniable. They're close now, close enough that backing out would feel like betrayal, close enough that publishing will change lives. Some will feel relief, others will feel attacked. The city will split. The church will respond. Loudly. As the team prepares the story, one thought echoes through the room, unspoken but shared. Once this goes out, nothing will ever be the same. And somewhere beyond Boston, beyond the globe, beyond this one investigation, something much bigger is starting to stir. The moment the documents are unsealed, the room changes. No celebration, no relief. Just a quiet understanding that this is the point of no return. Boxes line the walls like silent witnesses. Paper everywhere. Names bleeding through the pages again and again, refusing to stay buried. The files are clinical, cold, memos written in careful language that strips the horror down to procedure. Treatment recommended. Temporary leave. Reassignment. Each phrase feels like an erasure, not of events, of children. Walter reads one letter twice, then sets it down slowly. His hands don't shake, his chest does. Matt starts counting, not guessing, counting. Priests, parishes, years. The number grows past what anyone expected, past what feels possible. This isn't a handful of bad actors. It's a network. Structured, maintained. He pins the final figure to the board and steps back. No one speaks. The silence lands heavier than any argument. Mike follows the trail upward. The higher he goes, the more resistance he meets. Offices that once welcomed questions now politely, firmly. He requests interviews with senior church leadership. Doors close. Statements replace conversations. Carefully crafted words that say everything except the truth. He knows now. They aren't just hiding from the story. They're hiding from responsibility. Sacha returns to survivors with new information. Names they recognize. Priests they knew were moved, suddenly. The validation hits them harder than the memories. Some cry, some go still. One man whispers that he thought he imagined it all, that he spent years believing the church over himself. The damage wasn't just physical, it rewired lives. Inside the globe, the debate sharpens. Publish now or wait? The evidence is overwhelming, but the implications are massive. Lawsuits, loss of trust, accusations of anti-Catholic bias, advertisers nervous, readers furious, readers furious. This story will not be consumed calmly. It will explode. Marty listens, always listens. Then he draws the line. They don't just name priests, they name the system. They explain how secrecy worked, how authority shielded itself, how silence was enforced not by accident but by design. Anything less would be another form of protection. Walter feels the weight of it all settle onto his shoulders. He's responsible for this team, for this call, for the fallout. He remembers earlier years when stories like this were softened, delayed, missed. He won't do that again. Not now, not with this much truth in his hands. The church releases a final statement before publication. Regretful, defensive, promising reform. The timing feels strategic. Damage control before impact. It doesn't deny the abuse. It denies responsibility. The difference matters. Late one night, Mike stays behind alone, staring at the finished draft. Names, quotes, facts locked in place. He thinks about the men who trusted him with their stories, about the ones who didn't live long enough to see this moment. His jaw tightens. This isn't about journalism anymore. It's about reckoning. The presses are scheduled. A date circled in red. Everyone knows what that morning will bring. Calls from victims. Calls from lawyers. Calls from people who will say the globe has gone too far. The city will wake up different. As they prepare to send the story to print, one last realization settles over the room, chilling and unavoidable. If the church responds by apologizing, it will mean they knew all along. And if they don't, it will mean the fight has only just begun. The paper hits the streets before sunrise. Bundles thud onto doorsteps. Coffee shops unfold pages with shaking hands. Radios crackle with disbelief. By mid-morning, Boston feels like it's holding its breath. The phones at the Globe erupt. Survivors first. Voices breaking. Thank you. Finally, I thought I was alone. Some cry, some rage, some just breathe like they've been underwater for decades and finally surfaced. Sacha takes call after call, absorbing the weight of stories still spilling out. The article didn't end the pain, it unlocked it. Then come the other calls. Furious readers, parish members who feel attacked, parents who don't want to believe it, priests who say this tarnishes everyone, lawyers who speak in clipped, careful tones. The backlash is immediate and relentless. The city fractures along familiar lines. Faith versus fact, loyalty versus truth. The church responds publicly. Apologies, carefully chosen words, expressions of sorrow that never quite land on accountability. The statement admits harm, but avoids naming the mechanism that caused it. No mention of decisions, no acknowledgement of cover-up, just regret offered like a shield. Inside the newsroom, the team doesn't celebrate. There's no victory here, only momentum. Because the second the story breaks, the scale expands. Other cities start calling, other reporters, other victims. The pattern in Boston mirrors patterns elsewhere. Same tactics, same silence, same outcomes. What felt local now feels global. Mike pushes harder than ever. He follows leads pouring in from across the country. Lawsuits surface. Documents echo Boston's files almost word for word. The realization hits him hard. This wasn't an isolated failure of leadership, it was policy. Repeated. Defended. 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 Exported. Matt updates the board. The numbers climb again. New names, new parishes, new dioceses. The red strings spread beyond the city, beyond the state. He steps back and feels dizzy. This is bigger than journalism. It's institutional collapse unfolding in real time. Walter watches the coverage ripple outward. Other newsrooms follow. Investigations ignite. The silence that protected the church for generations starts to crack under collective scrutiny. He knows this is what accountability looks like. Messy, painful, necessary. But the cost is visible too. Survivors relive trauma as cameras turn toward them. Some regret speaking, some finally feel seen. There's no single outcome, just consequences layered on consequences. Late one evening, the team gathers quietly. Exhausted. Changed. They talk less about the story now and more about the people inside it. The men who carried this alone. The families who trusted blindly. The faith that meant something real to them before it was twisted into cover. Marty reminds them that this isn't the end. It never was. Publishing was a beginning. Truth doesn't fix everything. It just removes the lie. What comes after is up to the world. As night settles over Boston, church bells ring somewhere in the distance. The sound feels different now. Not comforting, not condemning, just exposed. And in newsrooms far beyond the city, reporters open old files, reread forgotten paragraphs, and ask the same dangerous question. How many did we miss? The storm doesn't peak. It concentrates. What once felt loud becomes focused, sharp, unavoidable. Lawsuits multiply, courtrooms fill. Names spoken out loud for the first time echo off wood-paneled walls. The truth, once printed, refuses to stay on paper. Survivors testify, some with steady voices, some barely holding together. They describe childhood moments frozen in time, a hand on a shoulder, a door closing, trust collapsing. The room listens differently now. No polite disbelief, no automatic defense, just the raw weight of what was taken. Years, innocence, faith. The church announces reforms, committees, reviews, new policies. The language sounds proactive, forward-looking, but for many, it's too late. The damage isn't procedural, it's human, and no policy can return what was lost. Mike sits through testimony, jaw clenched, notebook untouched. He doesn't need notes anymore. He knows this story by heart. He watches survivors reclaim pieces of themselves with every word spoken publicly. Painful, brave, necessary. He realizes journalism didn't create this reckoning. It just opened the door. Sacha stays close to the survivors, not as a reporter now, but as a witness. She sees relief mixed with grief, validation colliding with exhaustion. Some finally sleep better, others unravel all over again. Truth heals and hurts at the same time. There's no clean ending. Matt tracks outcomes. Settlements, resignations, priests removed, dioceses forced to release lists they once guarded fiercely. The numbers climb, then stabilize, then climb again. Each update feels heavier than the last. Accountability spreads, uneven but undeniable. Walter watches the institution he grew up with confront itself publicly. He doesn't feel satisfaction, he feels sorrow for the faith that mattered, for the leadership that failed it, for the people who paid the price for obedience. He understands now that loyalty without accountability is just another form of silence. The Globe receives awards, recognition, praise. It feels strange, almost inappropriate. The team accepts quietly. They know what this cost. They know what it still costs. Trophies don't balance scales like these. As the months pass, the story reshapes journalism itself. Newsrooms rethink what they ignored, what they deferred to authority, what they assumed someone else would handle. The ripple becomes a wave, then something closer to a reckoning. Late one night, Mike returns to the office alone. The boards are gone now, the red strings removed, the walls look bare. He stands there longer than necessary, remembering the weight of those early days, the fear, the doubt, the choice to keep going anyway. This wasn't about courage, it was about responsibility. Outside, the city moves forward, not healed, not whole, but aware. And awareness, once ignited, doesn't easily fade. The story that began as a whisper has become a permanent scar on the public record. Impossible to deny, impossible to forget. And as the final dust settles, one truth stands uncomfortably clear. Silence was the real crime. Years later, the newsroom feels quieter, not calmer, just different. The urgency has faded, replaced by something heavier, memory. The survivors don't disappear when headlines do. Some rebuild their lives with a strength that feels impossible. Others struggle in ways that never fully show. Justice came unevenly, late, incomplete. But truth gave them something silence never did: space to exist without shame. The church continues to reckon, slowly, imperfectly. Some leaders apologize sincerely. Others retreat behind doctrine and time. Faith fractures for many. For some, it survives, reshaped, no longer blind. For others, it's gone forever. Both outcomes feel justified. The Spotlight team moves on to other stories. Different investigations, different injustices. But this one never really leaves them. It lives in how carefully they listen now, how hard they push, how unwilling they are to accept quiet answers to loud questions. Walter walks past the old board one last time before it's cleared. He remembers the moment they realized how big it was, how wrong they'd all been. He understands now that journalism isn't about uncovering secrets. It's about refusing to look away. Mike still gets emails from strangers, from victims, from people saying they spoke up because Boston spoke first. He reads every one, not out of obligation, out of respect. Sacha keeps listening. That never changes. She knows stories don't end when they're published. They echo. They linger. They reshape the people who tell them and the people who hear them. Matt looks at data differently now. Numbers aren't abstract. Their lives stacked together, demanding recognition. The city of Boston carries the story quietly now, like a scar beneath clothing. Not always visible, always there. A reminder of what happens when power goes unquestioned and silence is mistaken for peace. In the end, Spotlight wasn't about exposing evil. It was about exposing indifference, the kind that lets harm repeat, the kind that protects institutions instead of children, the kind that thrives in shadows. And once the light hit it, once the truth was spoken clearly and publicly, the shadows had nowhere left to hide. Tom McCarthy is not the kind of director Hollywood usually hands an Oscar-worthy true story drama to. Before Spotlight, his reputation was built on intimate, character-first films like The Station Agent and Win-Win movies, more interested in quiet human behavior than grand statements. That background matters, because Spotlight doesn't feel like a crusader film engineered to provoke applause. It feels restrained, patient, almost stubbornly unflashy. And that restraint is the key to why the film lands with such force. McCarthy came to Spotlight as both a filmmaker and a former journalist. He had worked at newspapers early in his career, absorbing the rhythms of newsrooms, the unglamorous grind of reporting, and the moral tension between speed and accuracy. That experience shapes every frame of the film. This isn't a story about heroes charging into danger. It's about professionals doing their jobs correctly, even when doing so becomes emotionally unbearable. McCarthy understood that the real drama wasn't in explosive revelations, but in process documents reviewed, phone calls made, sources protected, stories held back until they were bulletproof. The project originated when screenwriters Josh Singer and Tom McCarthy himself began developing a script based on the Boston Globe's 2001-2002 investigation into systemic child abuse within the Catholic Church. The subject matter alone carried enormous weight, especially in Boston, where Catholicism isn't just a religion, it's part of the city's identity. McCarthy's vision was clear early on. No sensationalism, no courtroom theatrics, no melodrama engineered for easy outrage. The abuse itself would largely remain off-screen. The focus would stay with the journalists, their ethical responsibility, and the slow dawning realization of how deep the rot actually went. That decision runs counter to how Hollywood often handles stories of institutional corruption. There's no singular villain twirling a mustache, no grandstanding monologues about justice. Instead, McCarthy frames evil as bureaucratic, normalized, quietly protected by systems that prefer comfort over truth. The horror creeps in through repetition case after case, settlement after settlement, each one buried just enough to avoid real accountability. It's chilling precisely because it's mundane. McCarthy's directing style is almost aggressively invisible. The camera rarely calls attention to itself. Scenes play out in medium shots, letting actors inhabit space naturally, like you've wandered into a real newsroom and happened to overhear something important. This approach mirrors the Spotlight team's philosophy. Don't make yourself the story. Observe, verify, report. Even when emotions spike, McCarthy resists cinematic flourish. When characters are shaken, the film doesn't swell with music or dramatic lighting. It just sits there with them, uncomfortable, honest. The director was also deeply aware of the ethical minefield surrounding the story. This wasn't about condemning faith or painting believers as villains. McCarthy repeatedly emphasized that the film targets institutional failure, not spirituality. That nuance shaped his collaboration with actors and crew. Dialogue avoids speeches. Characters rarely articulate the film's themes outright. Instead, meaning emerges from behavior, from a lawyer dodging questions, from an editor hesitating before greenlighting a risky story, from a reporter realizing his own assumptions allowed harm to continue. Backing from participant media was crucial. The company had built a reputation for supporting socially conscious films without forcing them into didactic shapes. That freedom allowed McCarthy to trust the audience, to believe viewers didn't need hand-holding or emotional manipulation to grasp the gravity of what was unfolding. The film's moral clarity comes not from shouting, but from accumulation. By the time the full scope of abuse is revealed, the impact feels earned, not engineered. What's remarkable is how McCarthy balances anger with discipline. The film is furious beneath the surface, but it never loses control. That balance reflects the director's belief that outrage without rigor changes nothing. Journalism and cinema, in this case, only matters if it's precise. Every creative choice, from the stripped-down visual style to the procedural pacing, reinforces that philosophy. Spotlight doesn't ask you to feel, it asks you to understand. And understanding, McCarthy knows, is more dangerous to power than emotion alone. But vision alone doesn't make a film like this work. It needs a structure capable of carrying that restraint without collapsing under the weight of its subject. And that structure was forged on the page through years of writing, rewriting, and refining a story that had to be both meticulous and compelling. Because before a single performance could resonate, before a single frame could feel authentic, the script had to earn the right to tell this story at all. The discipline you feel in Spotlight, that sense of restraint bordering on stubbornness, was forged long before cameras rolled. It lives in the screenplay. And this script didn't arrive fully formed. It was wrestled into shape over years, through research-heavy drafts that treated journalism not as a backdrop, but as a dramatic engine in its own right. Josh Singer came to the project with a deep interest in institutional power and accountability. His previous work often orbited systems under stress, and Spotlight demanded exactly that mindset. The challenge was obvious from the start. How do you make a movie about reporters reading documents, making phone calls, and debating publication timelines feel urgent without resorting to manufactured suspense? The answer was structure precise, procedural, almost obsessive about cause and effect. Rather than framing the story around the abuse itself, the screenplay anchors itself to discovery. Each revelation is earned through labor. A legal document unlocked, a reluctant source slowly convinced, a single word, secrecy, that changes everything once its implications are understood. The script treats information like dynamite, but only after it's been carefully assembled. That's why the pacing feels deliberate instead of slow. You're always moving forward, even when the movement is incremental. Singer and McCarthy made a crucial decision early on. The film would not center on victims' testimony and graphic detail. That choice wasn't about avoidance. It was about respect and focus. Showing abuse, risks exploitation, and dramatizing trauma can shift attention away from accountability. Instead, the script keeps the camera on those who failed to act and those who finally did. The absence becomes louder than depiction. When characters react to what they're uncovering, your imagination fills the gaps, and that's far more unsettling. The screenplay structure mirrors investigative journalism itself. There's no traditional three-act escalation built around personal triumph. Instead, the story unfolds like a case file slowly opening. The first act establishes context, new leadership at the Globe, old assumptions lingering beneath the surface. The second act deepens the inquiry, revealing patterns that shatter the idea of isolated incidents. By the time the third act arrives, the conflict isn't about whether the story should run, but about how devastating the truth actually is. The tension comes from responsibility, not danger. Dialogue is where the script quietly flexes its muscle. Nobody speaks in speeches. Conversations overlap, trail off, circle back. People interrupt each other the way real colleagues do. When characters argue, it's rarely about morality in the abstract. It's about sourcing, confirmation, legal exposure. Those details ground the drama. They also create stakes that feel authentic. Publishing too early could collapse the entire investigation. Waiting too long could allow harm to continue. The script never simplifies that dilemma. One of the smartest writing choices is how the film handles time. The story spans months, yet it never announces time jumps with title cards or narration. Instead, progression is communicated through accumulation. Thicker folders, repeated names, growing unease. The writers trust viewers to keep up. That trust pays off. You feel the weight of the investigation because you experience it the way the characters do. Gradually, relentlessly, without relief. The script also resists the urge to personalize the story too neatly. Individual reporters have lives, beliefs, blind spots, but none of them get a tidy emotional arc that resolves everything. Michael Rezendes doesn't win. Marty Baron doesn't deliver a cathartic speech. Even moments of success are muted. When the story finally runs, the script undercuts celebration by immediately showing how widespread the abuse truly was. The victory is partial. The damage is permanent. That honesty is baked into the writing. Revisions focused heavily on accuracy. The writers consulted Globe journalists, reviewed timelines, and cross-checked scenes against real reporting practices. If a moment felt too cinematic but not truthful, it was reworked. That's why the film feels so confident in its mundanity. It knows exactly what it's doing. Nothing flashy sneaks in by accident. Perhaps the most powerful element of the screenplay is what it refuses to do. It doesn't tell you how to feel. It doesn't underline its outrage. It simply lays out facts in a dramatic sequence and lets your response emerge naturally. The final list of cities isn't framed as a twist. It's presented like a ledger. Cold, unforgiving, devastating. All of this precision on the page created a rare foundation, a script that demanded actors disappear into professionalism rather than perform showy transformations. Because when dialogue is this restrained and structure this tight, there's nowhere to hide. Every pause matters. Every look counts. And that meant casting couldn't be about star power alone. It had to be about credibility, chemistry, and restraint. By the time Spotlight reached the casting stage, the script had already set an uncompromising demand. No movie star vanity, no scene-stealing theatrics, no performances that reminded you were watching actors at work. These characters weren't meant to be icons. They were meant to feel like colleagues. People you'd overhear in an office, not admire from a distance. That requirement shaped every casting decision that followed. Tom McCarthy and casting director A.V. Kaufman approached the ensemble with a deceptively simple question: who could disappear into competence? The Spotlight team at the Boston Globe wasn't flashy in real life, and the film refused to mythologize them. The goal wasn't to cast the best actor for each role in isolation, but to assemble a group that felt like it had been working together for years. Familiarity mattered more than fireworks. Michael Keaton's casting as Walter Robinson is the spine of that philosophy. Keaton brings instant credibility, but not the kind that overwhelms a film. He has a lived-in quality, slightly rumpled, alert, quietly authoritative that fits a newsroom editor perfectly. Importantly, Keaton doesn't play Robbie as a crusader. He plays him as a manager weighing responsibility, history, and regret. The casting works because Keaton knows when to recede. He listens as well as he speaks. That's not accidental. It's discipline. Mark Ruffalo, cast as Michael Rezendes, was the most emotionally volatile choice in the group, and deliberately so. Rezendes is the reporter who pushes hardest, who bristles at delay, who feels the moral urgency most viscerally. Ruffalo had the range to access that intensity without tipping into melodrama. McCarthy needed an actor who could burn hot while still feeling grounded in process. Ruffalo's previous work had proven he could carry righteous anger, but here, it's tempered by professionalism. The casting hinges on that balance. Rachel McAdams, as Sacha Pfeiffer, represents one of the film's most quietly radical choices. In a lesser version of this story, her role might have been sentimentalized or reduced to empathy shorthand. Instead, McAdams plays Sacha with steadiness and moral clarity. She listens more than she reacts. Her casting counters expectations, not because McAdams lacks dramatic credibility, but because she resists showiness. The performance demands restraint, and McAdams understood that less expression would land harder than more. Brian Darcy James, cast as Matt Carroll, brings a different texture entirely. His background in theater gives him a precision and alertness that suits a reporter constantly juggling logistics. Carroll is often the connective tissue in scenes, the one tracking details while others debate philosophy. James doesn't demand attention, which is exactly why the casting works. You believe this is someone who thrives on keeping things moving. Liev Schreiber's Marty Baron might be the most strategically cast role in the film. Baron is an outsider. Jewish, newly arrived in Boston, emotionally reserved. Schreiber's natural composure and controlled physicality reinforce that separation. He doesn't need to announce authority, it's baked into his stillness. Casting someone more expressive would have softened the character's impact. Schreiber's restraint makes Baron feel immovable, which is crucial to the film's ethical framework. The supporting roles were cast with equal care. Stanley Tucci as Mitchell Garabedian could have easily slid into caricature, the lone crusading lawyer, marginalized and obsessive. Tucci avoids that trap by grounding Garabedian in exhaustion. His casting adds humanity without romanticizing obsession. Billy Crudup, as Eric McLeish, embodies institutional confidence so effortlessly that it becomes unsettling. The charm is the point. You understand how systems protect themselves through people who appear reasonable. Even smaller roles feel meticulously chosen. Actors playing priests, lawyers, editors, and victims all share a common quality. They look like people who belong in this world. No one feels over-curated. No one looks like they wandered in from a different genre. That cohesion is the result of casting as world-building, not star assembly. What's striking is how little ego any of this suggests. These are well-known actors, many of them capable of dominating scenes. Instead, they subordinate themselves to rhythm and realism. Scenes play like group problem-solving sessions, not platforms for performance. That chemistry can't be faked. It comes from casting people willing to listen on screen. The result is an ensemble where no single role feels inflated for awards consideration, even though several performances ultimately receive that recognition. The casting reinforces the film's core belief. The story is bigger than any individual. Credibility matters. Process matters. Ego doesn't. And once those actors were locked in, the challenge shifted again. Casting had assembled the right instruments. The next question was how those instruments would actually play together. How subtle choices, preparation, and performance craft would turn professionalism into something emotionally devastating. Because Spotlight doesn't ask actors to cry on cue, it asks them to think, hesitate, and absorb truths they can't unlearn. That's where performance stops being about selection and becomes about execution. The first time Spotlight really tightens its grip on you, it isn't because of a plot twist or a shocking reveal. It's because of a look. A pause. A breath held just a second too long. This is a film where performances don't announce themselves. They accumulate. And nowhere is that more evident than in the lead performances, where restraint becomes the most expressive tool of all. Mark Ruffalo's Michael Rezendes is the engine of agitation inside an otherwise controlled machine. Ruffalo plays him as a man permanently leaning forward, intellectually and emotionally. His body is rarely still. He talks with his hands, interrupts mid-thought, pushes conversations before they're ready. But here's the key. Ruffalo never lets that intensity feel performative. Rezendes isn't passionate because the movie needs passion. He's passionate because injustice, once seen clearly, becomes unbearable. Watch Ruffalo's eyes when he realizes the scope of the cover-up. No speech, just disbelief curdling into fury. It's not explosive, it's corrosive. Ruffalo reportedly immersed himself in the rhythms of investigative journalism, and you feel it in the way he handles scenes of process. Phone calls feel urgent. Interviews feel alive. When Rezendes argues for publishing sooner, Ruffalo doesn't play righteousness. He plays impatience with compromise. That distinction matters. It turns what could have been a stock truth seeker into a complicated professional wrestling with consequences. His most powerful moments arrive when his certainty crashes into reality. The anger is real. So is the helplessness. Michael Keaton's Robbie Robinson is the emotional counterweight, where Rezendes pushes, Robbie absorbs. Keaton plays him with quiet authority and, crucially, buried guilt. This is a man who grew up Catholic, in Boston, surrounded by the very institution now under scrutiny. Keaton doesn't underline that conflict. He lets it leak out in small moments. A hesitation before a decision, a subtle defensiveness when challenged. You can see Robbie recalibrating his identity in real time. Keaton's genius here lies in what he withholds. There's no grand reckoning scene where Robbie breaks down. Instead, the weight accumulates until it shows in his posture, his tired eyes, the way his voice softens when speaking to victims. The performance feels lived in, not constructed. And that makes the character's moral awakening more painful. This isn't a man discovering wrongdoing for the first time. It's a man realizing he may have looked away when it mattered. Rachel McAdams delivers the film's most quietly devastating performance. Sacha Pfeiffer isn't written as the emotional center, but McAdams makes her one anyway, through listening. Her scenes with survivors are models of restraint. She doesn't react with overt sympathy or shock. She creates space. Watch how she maintains eye contact, how her voice stays steady even as the stories become unbearable. That steadiness is a form of respect, and it's harder to play than tears. McAdams reportedly spent time speaking with the real Pfeiffer, absorbing her approach to interviews with trauma survivors. That preparation shows in the physicality of the performance. Sacha leans in slightly. She nods at the right moments. She lets silences stretch, and when emotion finally breaks through, often after the interview is over, it lands like a gut punch. The contrast between composure and collapse is where the performance lives. Brian Darcy James, as Matt Carroll, brings a different kind of tension. Carroll isn't driven by rage or guilt, he's driven by realization. James plays him as a man whose intellectual certainty suddenly collides with personal responsibility. The moment when Carroll connects the dots to his own children's school isn't played loudly. His face changes. That's it. But the implication is seismic. James understands that fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it goes very, very quiet. Liev Schreiber's Marty Baron operates on a different frequency entirely. Schreiber's performance is almost architectural clean lines, minimal ornamentation. Baron rarely raises his voice. He doesn't need to. Authority radiates from his stillness. But Schreiber avoids turning him into a cold enforcer. There's curiosity here, moral clarity. When Baron insists on holding the story until it's airtight, Schreiber makes the choice feel principled, not bureaucratic. What's fascinating is how Schreiber uses restraint as tension. In a film full of internal conflict, Baron's calm becomes unsettling. He doesn't flinch at the church's power. He doesn't share the city's history. That distance allows him to see what others normalized. Schreiber plays that outsider status without arrogance. He's not better, just unencumbered. And that difference changes everything. What unites these performances is a shared understanding of tone. Nobody pushes for dominance. Scenes feel like real conversations, shaped by overlapping priorities rather than scripted beats. Actors listen, they react, they interrupt, they allow moments to breathe. That collective discipline turns procedural scenes into character studies. And then there's the film's most emotionally crushing choice, denying actors the release of catharsis. Even the final moments resist triumph. Performances don't resolve, they endure. The characters don't walk away lighter, they carry the truth forward. That's the emotional thesis of Spotlight, and the actors honor it completely. These performances don't ask for admiration. They demand attention. They trust viewers to read between lines, to notice shifts in energy, to feel discomfort without being guided by sentimentality. It's acting built on trust. Trust in the material, in the audience, and in each other. Yet even the strongest lead performances don't exist in isolation. What gives Spotlight its texture, its sense of lived-in reality, is the constellation of supporting players orbiting these leads, each one adding pressure, resistance, or clarity. Because institutions don't exist in a vacuum, they're upheld, challenged, and complicated by the people moving quietly through their margins. What gives Spotlight its sense of lived-in authenticity isn't just the leads carrying the weight, it's the ecosystem around them. Institutions don't survive on figureheads alone. They're maintained by lawyers, priests, editors, gatekeepers, enablers, and bystanders. The supporting cast embodies that ecosystem with unsettling precision, turning brief scenes into moral pressure points. Stanley Tucci's Mitchell Garabedian is the film's most visibly worn character, and Tucci leans into exhaustion rather than heroism. Garabedian could have been framed as a lone warrior screaming into the void. Instead, Tucci plays him as someone who's been screaming for years and no longer expects an answer. His posture slumps, his voice carries the weight of repetition. When he speaks about sealed documents and systemic protection, there's no flourish, just weary certainty. That weariness is the performance. It tells you this fight has already taken pieces of him. Tucci's scenes crackle because he refuses sentimentality. Even when Garabedian helps unlock the case, he isn't grateful for attention. He's frustrated it took this long. Watch his eyes when the reporters finally understand what secrecy really means. There's no satisfaction there, only confirmation. The system did exactly what he said it did. Again. Billy Crudup's Eric McLeish represents the other side of that coin. Crudup plays him with such ease, such smooth professional warmth that it's almost disarming. This is intentional. McLeish isn't a villain in the traditional sense. He's a function. Crudup understands that power often wears a friendly face. His performance thrives on confidence without aggression. He smiles, he reassures, he deflects, and in doing so, he reveals how corruption survives without force. The brilliance of Crudup's performance lies in what's left unsaid. McLeish never admits wrongdoing. He doesn't have to. His job is to keep things calm, contained, and confidential. Crudup plays those instincts so naturally that you feel how easy it would be to accept his version of events if you weren't paying attention. That's exactly the danger the film exposes. John Slattery's Ben Bradley Jr. offers a different kind of institutional presence. As the Globe's managing editor, Bradley carries the weight of legacy journalism, the expectation of courage paired with caution. Slattery plays him as thoughtful, occasionally guarded, but fundamentally principled. His scenes with Marty Baron subtly dramatize the tension between tradition and disruption. There's respect there, but also friction. Slattery never turns Bradley into an obstacle. He's a steward, not a saboteur. Len Cariou, as Cardinal Bernard Law, appears sparingly, but his presence looms large. Cariou doesn't imbue Law with menace. He plays him with gentle authority, calm assurance, and polished dignity. That choice is devastating. There's no visible cruelty, no raised voice, just the soft power of someone who believes, or claims to believe, that he's protecting something sacred. Cariou's restraint forces the audience to confront an uncomfortable truth. Harm doesn't always come from obvious monsters. Sometimes it comes from men who sound reasonable. Even smaller roles feel exactingly cast. The priests interviewed don't look theatrical. They look ordinary. Lawyers blend into boardrooms. Parishioners feel familiar. Victims, portrayed with immense sensitivity, are never reduced to narrative devices. The actors playing survivors are given space, not speeches. Their performances are grounded in pauses, hesitations, and fragmented recollections. The film doesn't mine them for tears. It lets their stories exist, unfinished and unresolved. What's remarkable is how ensemble dynamics replace traditional hierarchy. No scene belongs entirely to one actor. Conversations are layered. Power shifts subtly depending on information, not rank. One moment a supporting character holds leverage, the next, they're irrelevant. That fluidity mirrors real investigative work, where progress depends on who knows what and who's willing to say it. Off-screen chemistry plays a role here. Many of these actors are seasoned professionals accustomed to collaboration. That comfort shows. Scenes feel inhabited rather than staged. People talk over each other. They disagree without theatrics. They share space naturally. It's the kind of ensemble cohesion you can't fake with coverage or editing. It has to be earned through casting and trust. The supporting cast also reinforces the film's central idea. Systems are upheld by many hands. No single character is responsible for everything. No single confrontation solves anything. Accountability emerges or fails through accumulation. Each performance adds a layer to that accumulation, making the institution feel dense, resistant, and frighteningly stable. And, because the ensemble feels so real, the film's moral weight multiplies. You don't walk away thinking about one villain or one hero. You think about structures, about complicity, about silence. The supporting performances widen the lens, transforming Spotlight from a newsroom drama into a portrait of how power protects itself in plain sight. With the cast fully assembled and working in quiet harmony, the next challenge was physical. building a world that felt authentic enough to disappear into. Offices, churches, courtrooms, apartments, none of it flashy, all of it crucial. Because when a film depends this heavily on credibility, even the walls have to tell the truth. By the time spotlight moves from performance to environment, you realize something quietly radical is happening. The movie refuses to aestheticize its own importance. The production design doesn't announce period detail. It doesn't romanticize journalism. It simply recreates spaces that feel used, imperfect, and inhabited. Because truth, the film argues, doesn't emerge from beautiful places. It emerges from functional ones. Production designer Eve Stewart approached the film with a philosophy of invisibility. Her task wasn't to impress the eye, but to remove friction between the audience and belief. Offices had to feel like offices. Churches had to feel familiar, not ominous. Courtrooms had to feel procedural, not theatrical. The success of her work lies in how rarely you notice it, until you realize how much it's doing. The Boston Globe newsroom is the film's central physical space, and it's treated like a living organism. Desks are cluttered but not chaotic. Papers stack up organically. Bulletin boards carry outdated notices alongside urgent reminders. Computer monitors glow with early 2000s interfaces, functional, unadorned, slightly cold. Nothing feels curated. Everything feels mid-task. You sense history in the space, not nostalgia. Stewart resisted the temptation to exaggerate the newsroom's visual energy. No dramatic lighting, no sweeping architectural angles. Instead, the room feels compressed, practical, busy without being frantic. That choice reinforces the film's procedural rhythm. This is a place where work accumulates slowly through repetition. The environment mirrors that accumulation. Church interiors are handled with equal restraint. The film avoids Gothic exaggeration or ominous shadow play. These are ordinary places of worship, clean, symmetrical, calm, and that's what makes them unsettling. By refusing to visually mark churches as sinister, the production design underscores the film's most uncomfortable idea. Abuse didn't hide in darkness. It existed in plain sight, within spaces designed to inspire trust. Homes, too, tell stories. Sacha Pfeiffer's apartment feels modest and quiet, a place of decompression rather than drama. Robbie Robinson's spaces carry generational weight. Catholic imagery present but unobtrusive, part of the background rather than a focal point. Matt Carroll's home becomes emotionally charged, not because of design flourish, but because it feels safe. That safety is what gets disrupted. Color palette plays a subtle but powerful role. The film leans into muted tones, grays, beiges, watered-out blues. Nothing pops. Nothing demands attention. The absence of visual vibrancy reflects the emotional suppression at the heart of the story. These are spaces where difficult truths are filed away, not confronted. When moments of warmth appear, they feel fleeting, almost accidental. Costume design follows the same philosophy. Characters dress practically, repeating outfits, favoring comfort over expression. Jackets hang loosely, shirts wrinkle, ties are functional, not stylish. This isn't about individuality, it's about role. Everyone looks like they belong to the same ecosystem, differentiated only by subtle details. That uniformity reinforces the ensemble dynamic. No one dresses like the main character. Props are used sparingly but meaningfully. File folders thicken over time. Manila envelopes become visual shorthand for progress and burden. Phones ring constantly, anchoring scenes and interruption rather than control. Even newspapers themselves, physical, tangible, carry weight. When the story finally prints, the object matters. Ink on paper. Irreversible. One of Stewart's smartest choices was resisting period fetishism. Early 2000s. Boston is recreated accurately, but without winking at the audience. No needle-drop nostalgia, no obvious signifiers screaming, era. The focus stays on continuity, not contrast. This could be yesterday. That timelessness sharpens the film's relevance. The production design also supports McCarthy's directing style by allowing scenes to play in uninterrupted space. Rooms are arranged to accommodate natural movement and conversation. Characters cross frames organically. Blocking feels unforced. That freedom gives performances room to breathe, reinforcing realism. What ultimately emerges is a world that doesn't compete with the story. It carries it. The environments absorb tension rather than amplify it. They hold secrets without dramatizing them. And because everything feels so ordinary, the revelations land harder. You're not watching a heightened version of reality, you're watching something dangerously close to it. With the physical world firmly grounded, The next layer of storytelling shifts from what surrounds the characters to how we see them. Because even the most authentic set means little without a visual language that knows when to observe and when to intrude. And Spotlight cinematography understands that the most powerful move is often to stay still. Spotlight announces its visual philosophy almost immediately by refusing to announce itself at all. There are no showy opening shots, no restless camera movements designed to impress. Instead, the cinematography settles into observation steady, patient, almost stubbornly restrained. This isn't a film that wants to dazzle your eyes, it wants to train them. Cinematographer Masanobu Takeyanagi approached the project with the same ethic guiding the reporting at its center. Don't distort the truth by overframing it. His camera behaves like a silent colleague in the room, present, attentive, never intrusive. Shots are composed to feel functional rather than expressive, but that simplicity is deceptive. Every choice is calibrated to reinforce credibility. The camera is most often positioned at eye level. That sounds minor, but it's foundational. Eye-level framing creates equality between characters, between subject and audience. There's no visual hierarchy imposed through low-angle power shots or high-angle diminishment. Editors, lawyers, priests, victims, all are seen on the same plane. The film refuses to visually editorialize power. It lets behavior do the work. Lens choices favor natural perspective. Takeyanagi avoids extreme wide angles that would distort space or telephoto lenses that would compress it artificially. Rooms feel like rooms. Distance feels earned. When characters sit across a table, the space between them carries weight because it feels real, not manipulated. This fidelity to spatial truth anchors the film's emotional honesty. Lighting follows a similar philosophy. Practical sources dominate. Desk lamps, overhead fluorescents, window light filtered through overcast Boston skies. Faces are evenly lit, rarely sculpted for drama. Shadows exist, but they're soft, incidental, unromantic. That choice matters. The film isn't interested in turning information into spectacle. It's interested in clarity. When darkness does creep in, it's environmental rather than expressive. Night scenes aren't soaked in noir aesthetics. They're simply darker because night is darker. Offices empty out. Streets quiet down. The absence of stylization reinforces isolation. These are moments when the characters are alone with what they know. Camera movement is restrained to the point of invisibility. Most scenes rely on static shots or gentle pans that follow conversation rather than dictate it. When the camera does move, you feel it, because it's rare. Those movements often coincide with realizations or shifts in control. A slow push-in during a conversation signals not emotional manipulation, but intellectual convergence. Information is landing. Stakes are sharpening. One of the film's most effective visual strategies is repetition. Similar setups recur: reporters at desks, interviews across tables, files passed between hands. The framing remains consistent, almost monotonous. That monotony is intentional. It mirrors the grind of investigative work. Each scene alone feels small. Together, they build momentum through accumulation. The cinematography becomes procedural rhythm. Depth of field is used sparingly but meaningfully. Many scenes keep backgrounds in focus, grounding characters in context. You're constantly aware of the environment, the office buzzing behind them, the city pressing in beyond windows. When the background softens, it's often during moments of internal reckoning. The world falls away briefly. Then it snaps back. One quietly powerful visual motif is obstruction. Frames are frequently bisected by doorways, window frames, file cabinets, or glass partitions. Characters are seen through barriers, literal and symbolic. Information is always partially blocked. Truth is always mediated. These compositions don't call attention to themselves, but they reinforce the film's thematic spine. Access is controlled. Takeyanagi also understands when not to show. The film famously avoids visualizing abuse. That restraint extends to cinematography. Scenes involving victims are framed with respect: medium shots, stable compositions, no invasive close-ups mining pain. The camera listens, it doesn't interrogate. That ethical stance is baked into the visual language. Exterior shots of Boston are similarly understated. There are no sweeping cityscapes or romantic skyline montages. Buildings loom, functional and gray. Streets feel narrow. The city isn't a character, it's a system. The Globe Building, the churches, the courthouses all feel part of the same architectural vocabulary. Stone, glass, brick, permanence. Editing works hand in hand with cinematography to maintain momentum without flash. Cuts favor continuity over punctuation. Scenes end when information has landed, not when emotion peaks. Transitions are clean, almost blunt. The film trusts viewers to feel impact without editorial emphasis. One of the most striking sequences visually is also one of the quietest, the publication of the story. There's no slow-motion printing press, no swelling music cue guiding your reaction. The camera observes papers being picked up, read, folded, phones start ringing. The effect is cumulative, not explosive. The visual restraint makes the consequences feel real. What Takayanagi achieves is a visual language that disappears into function, and in doing so, amplifies meaning. You don't remember specific shots because you weren't meant to. You remember the experience of watching truth emerge step by step without cinematic interference. And once you notice how little the film asks of your eyes, you start paying attention to something else entirely, what you're hearing. Because in a movie this quiet, sound carries enormous weight. The absence of music, the texture of silence, the constant intrusion of ringing phones, all of it becomes emotional architecture. What the camera observes, the soundtrack defines. And that sonic landscape is just as disciplined, just as intentional as everything you've seen. If Spotlight's images train you to watch carefully, its sound design trains you to listen harder. This is a film that understands silence as pressure, noise as intrusion, and music as something almost dangerous if used incorrectly. So it's used sparingly, nearly withheld. And that restraint turns the audio landscape into one of the film's most quietly devastating elements. Howard Shore's name in the opening credits might surprise you. This is the composer of The Lord of the Rings, of sweeping themes and operatic emotion. Here, he does the opposite. Shore's score barely announces itself, and when it does, it's understated to the point of near invisibility. That's intentional. Music in Spotlight doesn't tell you how to feel. It arrives only when emotion has already earned the right to exist. For long stretches, there is no score at all. Instead, the film relies on diegetic sound, the world as it exists inside the story. Phones ring, printers hum, chairs scrape, footsteps echo down empty hallways. These sounds create rhythm. They also create tension. Silence isn't empty here, it's textured. You hear rooms breathing. You hear pauses stretching longer than comfort allows. The newsroom becomes a symphony of interruption. Telephones cut through conversations mid-sentence. Editors call across desks. Voices overlap. This isn't chaotic sound design, it's controlled density. The mix ensures dialogue remains clear while preserving the feeling of constant pressure. No one gets to think in peace. That sonic environment mirrors investigative reality. Truth doesn't arrive in quiet moments, it arrives while something else is demanding attention. Sound designer Skip Leavesay uses restraint as an ethical tool. Scenes with survivors are stripped back almost completely. Ambient noise softens. Music stays away. What remains is voice, breath, hesitation. The absence of score refuses emotional manipulation. You aren't guided toward a reaction. You're asked to sit with what's being said. The discomfort comes from attention, not amplification. When Shore's music does surface, it's minimal piano lines, low strings, restrained motifs that never resolve fully. The score feels suspended, as if holding its breath. It often enters late and exits early, refusing to linger. These cues don't underline revelations, they acknowledge weight. There's a difference. The music doesn't say, "This is important." It says, "This will stay with you." One of the most effective uses of sound comes through repetition. The constant ringing of phones becomes a narrative signal. Early on, it's just background texture. By the end, it feels ominous. When the story publishes and phones light up across the newsroom, the sound transforms from nuisance to consequence. Each ring is a ripple. Each call suggests another life impacted. No music could communicate that scale more honestly. Silence, though, is the film's sharpest instrument. Moments after major discoveries are often followed by near quiet. No reaction shots scored for release, just characters absorbing information. Silence forces viewers to do the same. It creates space for moral weight to land without distraction. That space is uncomfortable and vital. The film also avoids sonic spectacle in its climax. There's no triumphant swell as the presses roll. No dramatic crescendo as justice begins. Instead, the soundscape stays procedural. Papers rustle, phones ring, conversations begin, life continues. That choice reinforces the film's worldview. Exposure is not an ending. It's a beginning, and often a painful one. Even ambient city sounds are subdued. Boston never roars. Traffic hums at a distance. Sirens are rare. The city feels enclosed, insulated, reinforcing the sense of institutions operating within their own bubbles. Sound doesn't expand outward, it circles inward. What's remarkable is how this sonic minimalism amplifies emotional impact. By refusing to cue reactions, the film respects the audience's intelligence and emotional autonomy. You're not told when to feel outrage or sorrow. You feel it because the sound, or lack of it, makes room. In Spotlight, music and sound aren't there to elevate drama. They're there to preserve truth. They function like the reporting itself, careful, restrained, resistant to exaggeration. And just like the investigation, their power lies not in volume, but in persistence. With the film's sensory language fully established, image, sound, silence working in concert, the question becomes how all of this came together under real-world constraints. Because making a movie this controlled, this restrained, doesn't happen by accident. It requires a production process just as disciplined as the story it tells. And behind that discipline lies a journey filled with logistical challenges, ethical considerations, and moments where everything could have slipped into something louder and easier. By the time Spotlight entered production, the film's philosophy was already clear and fragile. A story this restrained could easily tip into flatness if mishandled, or into sensationalism if fear took over. The production journey became an exercise in protecting tone under pressure, making sure nothing in the real-world process betrayed the discipline the story demanded. Principal photography took place largely in Boston, a decision that carried both authenticity and risk. This wasn't just a backdrop, it was the story's emotional terrain. Many crew members lived in the city. Some had personal connections to the church. That proximity created an atmosphere of responsibility rather than distance. The production wasn't parachuting in to exploit a scandal, it was working inside a community still reckoning with it. The Boston Globe allowed access to its facilities, but with limitations. The newsroom scene in the film was recreated rather than filmed entirely on location, giving the crew control while preserving accuracy. Journalists were consulted constantly, not as symbolic advisors, but as practical ones. If a scene felt too efficient, it was reworked. Real reporting is messy. The film had to honor that mess. Tom McCarthy's on-set approach mirrored his directing style. Quiet, collaborative, precise. He avoided grand speeches and emotional hype. Scenes were discussed in terms of intention, not performance. What does the character need from this moment? What information changes hands? That clarity kept actors grounded in task rather than emotion. The result was consistency. No scene broke tone by trying too hard. One of the biggest challenges was emotional calibration. The subject matter is inherently explosive, and early takes sometimes lean too far into visible outrage. McCarthy often pulled things back. Less reaction, fewer raised voices, hold it, let it sit. That restraint wasn't about dampening emotion, it was about letting it accumulate naturally. The hardest moments weren't played loud. They were played honest. Ethical considerations hovered over the entire shoot. Scenes involving survivors were handled with particular care. Actors portraying victims were never rushed. Takes were limited. The crew kept sets quiet and minimal during these moments. There was a shared understanding that the film's responsibility extended beyond storytelling. It extended to how that story was made. Logistically, the production moved quickly but deliberately. This wasn't a sprawling shoot with room for indulgence. Schedules were tight. Locations were often functional rather than cinematic. Offices, apartments, hallways, spaces chosen for truth, not beauty. That efficiency reinforced the film's procedural energy. Everyone knew the clock was ticking, just like in the story. One of the most striking behind-the-scenes realities is how little improvisation made it into the final cut. Not because actors weren't capable, but because the script was so precise. Improvisation risked softening language that had been sharpened through years of revision. When actors did adjust lines, it was usually to make them more mundane, not more dramatic. Real speech was the goal. The most emotionally charged day of filming reportedly came not during confrontations, but during quieter scenes, actors reading documents, absorbing implications. Crew members described a heaviness settling in as the scale of the story became undeniable, even for those who already knew it. The repetition of names, the realization of scope, the weight didn't arrive all at once, it crept in. Post-production presented its own test of discipline. Editing focused on subtraction. Scenes that explained too much were trimmed or removed. Reaction shots were shortened. Music cues were reduced. The team consistently asked the same question: does this help truth emerge, or does it tell the audience what to feel? If it was the latter, it went. Test screenings reinforced the film's confidence. Audiences leaned in rather than checking out. Silence in the room became a signal, not a concern. The filmmakers resisted pressure to heighten drama or clarify morality. The discomfort was the point. Perhaps the most telling behind-the-scenes decision was what not to include. There are no epilogues naming villains with flourish, no staged reckonings. The real world, the film understood, doesn't resolve neatly. Accountability unfolds unevenly. Pain lingers. Justice arrives late, if at all. That realism shaped every stage of production. Spotlight wasn't made to be inspirational, it was made to be accurate. And that accuracy required constant vigilance, from the first day of shooting to the final cut. Once the film was complete, the question shifted from craft to consequence. How would a restrained procedural drama about journalism perform in a marketplace dominated by spectacle? Would audiences show up? Would studios see value in a film that refused to shout? The answer, measured in numbers and response, would reveal just how much space still existed for films like this. When Spotlight arrived in theaters, it did so without the usual weapons of a prestige release. No explosive trailer moments. No easily marketable hook beyond journalism movie. No stars selling transformation narratives. On paper, it was a financial risk. A dialogue-driven procedural about systemic abuse released into a marketplace dominated by franchises and spectacle. And yet, its commercial journey tells a quiet story of confidence, patience, and trust in adult audiences. The film opened in limited release in November 2015, a deliberate strategy. This wasn't about chasing opening weekend headlines, it was about building credibility. Early screenings positioned Spotlight as a serious awards contender, allowing word of mouth to grow among critics, journalists, and cinephiles, the very audience most attuned to its subject matter. The rollout mirrored the investigation itself, slow, methodical, resistant to shortcuts. Initial box office numbers were modest. There was no sudden surge, no breakout moment that signaled instant success. But the film held. Week after week, attendance remained steady. That stability mattered more than raw totals. It suggested engagement rather than curiosity. People weren't just showing up, they were recommending it. The film's legs became its story. As the release expanded nationwide, Spotlight benefited from timing. Awards season chatter amplified its visibility without distorting its identity. Each nomination reinforced the idea that this was a film worth seeking out, not because it was entertaining in a conventional sense, but because it was necessary viewing. That perception translated into sustained box office growth rather than front-loaded spikes. Commercially, Spotlight was never designed to dominate international markets, and it didn't need to. Its strength lay in domestic performance, particularly in urban centers and college towns where adult dramas traditionally find their footing. The film played especially well in cities with strong journalistic cultures, where audiences recognized the procedural rhythms and ethical stakes as familiar rather than distant. The film's budget, modest by studio standards, played a crucial role in its success. Without the burden of blockbuster expectations, Spotlight didn't need massive returns to justify its existence. Profitability was measured in sustainability rather than spectacle. This financial model allowed the film to be what it was without compromise. Home media and digital platforms extended its reach significantly. Spotlight proved to be the kind of film people sought out after hearing conversations about it, on podcasts, in classrooms, in newsrooms. It became part of professional discourse, not just entertainment consumption. That long tail reinforced its commercial value beyond theatrical windows. Perhaps most importantly, Spotlight demonstrated that adult, dialogue-driven dramas still had a place in the market, if released with patience and respect for audience intelligence. Its box office success wasn't loud, but it was meaningful. It validated a type of filmmaking that had been increasingly sidelined. In an industry obsessed with scale, Spotlight offered an alternative metric: impact over immediacy. It didn't chase attention, it earned it. And as numbers stabilized and awards recognition intensified, the conversation around the film shifted. Financial performance became secondary to cultural resonance. Critics, audiences, and institutions began grappling not just with whether the film worked, but with what it represented and why it mattered at that particular moment. By the time Spotlight reached the heart of awards season, the conversation around it had already shifted from, "Is it good?" to "Why does this feel necessary?" Critical reception wasn't just positive, it was unusually unified, especially for a film this restrained. Reviewers didn't latch onto spectacle or sentiment, they focused on rigor, discipline, moral clarity earned through process rather than proclamation. Critics responded strongly to the film's refusal to sensationalize its subject. Many highlighted how rare it was to see a movie about abuse that centered accountability instead of trauma consumption. The consensus wasn't that Spotlight was emotionally overwhelming, it was that it was intellectually devastating. Review after review praised its patience, its trust in audience intelligence, and its resistance to cinematic manipulation. Performances were singled out not for showiness, but for cohesion. Critics emphasized the ensemble rather than any single standout, which is itself a form of praise. The acting wasn't framed as awards bait, it was framed as service, to story, to truth, to restraint. That collective discipline became part of the film's identity. There were dissenting voices, but they were telling. Some critics found the film too dry, too procedural, too emotionally distant. That criticism revealed more about expectation than execution. Spotlight doesn't aim to comfort or cathart. Its emotional payoff comes from understanding, not release. For viewers expecting outrage or righteous fury, the film's calm could feel frustrating. But for many, that calm was the point. Audience response mirrored critical reaction in an unusually aligned way. Viewers described leaving theaters quiet, thoughtful, unsettled. Conversations happened afterward, not during. Social media reaction wasn't driven by quotable moments or viral scenes. It was driven by reflection. People shared articles. They discussed institutions. They talked about journalism. The film didn't dominate feeds. It lingered in minds. Awards recognition followed organically. Spotlight wasn't positioned as a flashy frontrunner, but it kept appearing, nominations accumulating, wins reinforcing its credibility. When it ultimately took home major honors, including Best Picture, the reaction wasn't shock. It felt like acknowledgement catching up to inevitability. The industry recognized itself in the film at its best, holding power accountable through craft. What made the awards conversation particularly potent was timing. Spotlight arrived during a period of growing skepticism toward institutions, religious, political, media alike. Trust was eroding. Whistleblowers and investigative reporters were becoming cultural figures again. In that climate, the film felt less like a period piece and more like a warning. Critics noted how contemporary it felt, despite being rooted in early 2000s events. The film also sparked renewed discussion about journalism's role in democracy. Newsrooms embraced it. Journalism schools screened it. Reporters debated its accuracy and largely endorsed it. That endorsement mattered. Spotlight wasn't just praised by critics, it was validated by the profession it portrayed. That alignment is rare. Culturally, the film resisted memification. It didn't generate catchphrases or iconic imagery. Its influence was quieter. It recentered process as drama. It reminded audiences that change often comes not from heroes, but from persistence. In an era increasingly dominated by immediacy and outrage, Spotlight argued for patience and found an audience willing to listen. Over time, the film's reputation has only solidified. Reappraisals haven't uncovered hidden flaws or dated perspectives. If anything, the film feels more relevant as institutional accountability continues to fracture. Critics looking back often note how prescient its restraint was, how it avoided the pitfalls of moral grandstanding that date films quickly. By the end of its critical journey, Spotlight wasn't just well-reviewed, it was trusted. Trusted to tell the truth carefully, trusted to respect its subject, trusted to leave space for thought rather than filling it with noise. And that trust is the foundation of its legacy. Because beyond awards, beyond reception, beyond box office, the film ultimately asks a deeper question. One that extends past journalism and into every system built on silence. What happens when attention finally arrives? Answering that question means stepping back, looking at the film as a whole, and confronting the themes it refuses to simplify. That's where Spotlight leaves its most lasting mark. Spotlight doesn't end with closure, it ends with continuation. That choice defines its themes, its legacy, and its quiet power. This is a film uninterested in emotional release because the truth it confronts doesn't offer one. Instead, it leaves you with weight and the responsibility of carrying it forward. At its core, Spotlight is about systems that survive because they are normalized. Abuse persists not only through cruelty, but through routine, through paperwork, through silence that feels polite. The film dismantles the comforting myth that evil announces itself loudly. Here, harm hides in procedure, in sealed documents, in phone calls returned just late enough. The true antagonist isn't a person, it's structure. Journalism, in this framing, isn't heroic by default. It's fallible, complicit, delayed. The film makes a point of showing how even good reporters missed what was in front of them. That acknowledgement matters. Spotlight isn't a self-congratulatory ode to the press. It's a reckoning. Accountability applies inward before it turns outward. That's the film's ethical spine. One of the film's most enduring themes is patience as resistance. In an age of speed, the Spotlight team's insistence on verification feels almost radical. They wait, they double-check, they hold back publication until the truth is undeniable. The film argues that slowness, when paired with rigor, can be an act of courage. That message has only grown sharper as media cycles accelerate and attention fragments. Silence is another central motif, but not the absence of sound. The silence of deference. The silence of discomfort. The silence that protects reputations at the expense of lives. The film doesn't demonize faith, but it interrogates authority. It asks what happens when institutions prioritize preservation over people, and it refuses to let that question remain historical. The final sequence, listing cities where abuse surfaced, reframes everything you've watched. This wasn't a contained story. It wasn't even a Boston story. It was, and remains, systemic. The film's legacy lives in that moment. It transforms a narrative into a warning. Attention is not resolution. Exposure is not healing. Truth is only the first step. Within Tom McCarthy's filmography, Spotlight stands as a defining work, not because it's louder or more ambitious than his earlier films, but because it perfects his instincts. Character-driven storytelling, moral complexity, respect for audience intelligence. This is McCarthy at his most disciplined, trusting craft over flourish. The film's influence is visible in how subsequent journalism dramas approach the genre. There's less appetite now for grandstanding monologues and more respect for process. Spotlight recalibrated expectations. It reminded filmmakers and audiences that watching people do their jobs well can be gripping when the stakes are real. Rewatchability is one of the film's quiet strengths. Knowing where the story goes doesn't dull its impact. In some ways, it sharpens it. You notice earlier moments of hesitation. You catch lines that land differently. The film becomes less about discovery and more about inevitability. The slow, tragic realization that the truth was always there. Is Spotlight perfect? No. Its emotional restraint can feel distant to viewers seeking catharsis. Its procedural focus demands patience. But those qualities aren't flaws so much as commitments. The film knows exactly what it's doing and what it refuses to do. Ultimately, Spotlight asks something rare of its audience. Not applause, not outrage, but attention. Sustained, uncomfortable attention. It asks you to consider how many truths remain buried simply because uncovering them would disrupt too much comfort. That's its legacy. Not as a movie that tells you what happened, but as one that reminds you what happens when people finally decide to look. The moment Spotlight ends, most films would offer relief, closure, a sense that something has been fixed. This one doesn't. Instead, it leaves you in a strange emotional space after impact, before resolution. The story has broken, but nothing feels settled. And that unease isn't accidental. It's the film's most honest statement. After publication, there is no victory montage, no cheering newsroom. Phones ring, yes, but not as a symbol of triumph. They ring because consequences have begun. Each call represents another wound reopening, another institution scrambling, another truth surfacing too late. The film understands that exposure doesn't conclude harm, it rearranges it. Responsibility shifts, pain migrates. The damage doesn't disappear, it changes shape. This is where Spotlight separates itself from most important movies. It doesn't confuse revelation with repair. The investigation does what journalism can do, make information undeniable. What society does with that information remains unresolved. The film refuses to imagine justice where none is guaranteed. That refusal is deeply unsettling. Viewers are conditioned to expect narrative compensation suffering balanced by redemption, trauma countered by change. Spotlight denies that comfort. Some perpetrators face consequences, many don't. Some institutions reform, others adapt. The ending doesn't reassure because reassurance would be dishonest. What lingers most powerfully is the realization that journalism's role is limited by design. Reporters uncover, they publish, then they step back. They don't prosecute, they don't heal, they don't rebuild trust. The film forces you to sit with that limitation. Truth is necessary, but it is not sufficient. The aftermath also reframes the reporters themselves. Throughout the film, they are defined by purpose. After publication, that purpose dissolves. What replaces it? The movie never shows us, but the implication is heavy. You don't walk away from work like this unchanged. You carry it into future stories, into personal relationships, into silence. That weight explains why the film avoids depicting celebration. Joy would feel false. Relief would feel earned too easily. Instead, the newsroom returns to motion. Work continues. That continuation is both hopeful and bleak. Hopeful because attention persists. Bleak because attention must persist forever. The broader implication is uncomfortable. Institutions do not collapse under exposure. They absorb it. They issue statements. They restructure. They wait. Spotlight suggests that power survives not by denying truth outright, but by outlasting outrage. That's why the film's restraint matters so much. It refuses to spend emotional currency cheaply because it knows the real fight is long. There's also an implicit challenge embedded in the film's ending, directed not at characters, but at viewers. Now that you know, what changes? Awareness is not action. Outrage is not accountability. The film doesn't prescribe answers. It simply removes excuses. This is why Spotlight feels heavier after it ends than while you're watching it. The story transfers responsibility outward. The investigation is complete. The rest belongs to the world beyond the frame. And that transfer is where the film's true power lies. It doesn't ask to be admired. It asks to be carried into conversations, into institutions, into skepticism, into vigilance. Most films fade out. Spotlight doesn't. It steps aside. Because the story it tells was never meant to be contained. What Spotlight understands, perhaps more than any journalism film before it, is that knowledge comes with a cost, not the cinematic kind, not danger, not glory, something quieter, something that lingers. The cost of knowing is not what happens during the investigation, it's what happens after you can no longer unknow what you've learned. The film never dramatizes this explicitly, but it's everywhere if you watch closely. In the way characters fall silent after interviews, in how conversations trail off instead of resolving, in the absence of release. These journalists aren't traumatized in the traditional narrative sense. They're altered. And alteration is harder to process than injury. Take Michael Rezendes. His urgency isn't just moral, it's psychological. Once the scope of abuse becomes clear, waiting becomes intolerable, not because of ego, but because delay now carries faces, names, numbers that refuse abstraction. Ruffalo's performance hints at the toll this takes, the restless body, the clipped speech, the impatience that borders on desperation. This isn't crusading energy. It's the anxiety of someone carrying more truth than the system is prepared to absorb. Robbie Robinson's burden cuts differently. His cost is retrospective. He doesn't just learn something new, he reinterprets his past. The film's most devastating idea is that good intentions don't absolve inaction. Robbie has lived his entire life inside a culture that normalized silence, and now he has to confront that normalization as failure. There's no catharsis for that realization, only quiet reckoning. Sacha Pfeiffer's emotional toll is the most understated and perhaps the most profound. She listens, over and over. She absorbs stories without reacting, because reacting would center herself. That discipline has a price. The film allows brief glimpses of it, the moment alone after interviews, the delayed emotional response, the weight settling once professionalism no longer shields her. This is empathy without armor. It leaves marks. What Spotlight refuses to show is healing. There are no scenes of processing, therapy, or closure. That absence is honest. Journalism doesn't come with decompression chambers. You move on to the next story carrying residue from the last. The film respects that reality by not inventing relief where none exists. This is also why the movie avoids framing the reporters as saviors. Saviors imply resolution. Instead, these are people who did what they could and must now live with the consequences of having done it. That's a harder, more adult moral space. It rejects the fantasy that truth-telling automatically redeems the truth-teller. The cost extends beyond individuals to the profession itself. Once you expose a system this deeply compromised, you can't return to naivete. Trust fractures. Skepticism becomes default. That's necessary, but it's also exhausting. The film hints at this in Marty Baron's outsider status. His clarity comes from distance, but distance carries loneliness. You don't belong fully to a community once you've interrogated its foundations. There's an unspoken grief embedded here, the loss of innocence, not just personal, but collective. Communities built on trust feel different once that trust collapses. The film doesn't dramatize parishioners in crisis, but it doesn't need to. The implication hangs heavy. Faith, once shaken, doesn't snap back into place. And then there's the audience. Watching Spotlight carries its own cost. You can't dismiss what you've seen as aberration. The film dismantles the comfort of believing abuse is rare, contained, or historical. It hands you awareness, and awareness is weight. The movie doesn't tell you what to do with it, it simply refuses to carry it for you. This is where Spotlight becomes something more than a film about journalism. It becomes a meditation on moral endurance. What does it mean to live in a world where systems fail predictably, where truth arrives late, where doing the right thing doesn't fix everything? The movie doesn't answer these questions. It leaves them with you. And maybe that's the point. Knowledge isn't supposed to feel good. It's supposed to feel necessary. The cost of knowing is discomfort, vigilance, responsibility without guarantee. Spotlight honors that cost by never pretending otherwise. Because the most dangerous lie isn't that injustice doesn't exist, it's that once revealed, it's finished. The longer Spotlight stays in your mind, the more it starts to feel like a film made for the present tense, no matter when you watch it. What once played as a measured look back at early 2000s journalism now feels almost confrontational in a media environment defined by speed, outrage, and algorithmic reward. The movie hasn't changed. The world around it has. And that contrast is jarring. Spotlight belongs to a time when verification was a virtue, not a delay. In today's attention economy, the film's central obsession, waiting until a story is airtight, can feel almost alien. Watch those scenes now, and they play like resistance. The reporters argue not about whether the truth matters, but about whether they can afford to be patient. That question lands harder today than it did in 2015. The film quietly indicts modern media without ever mentioning it. There are no hot takes here, no viral moments, no performative outrage. Information moves slowly, deliberately, through human hands. The danger isn't being first, it's being wrong. That value system feels increasingly fragile in a culture where immediacy is monetized and correction is optional. What Spotlight shows is that real accountability requires friction. It requires delay. It requires people willing to be unpopular, ignored, or called cautious when caution is the point. The Spotlight team isn't rewarded instantly for restraint. They're pressured, doubted, second-guessed. And yet restraint is the reason the story survives scrutiny. In today's landscape, that lesson feels almost radical. The film also exposes how outrage can substitute for understanding. Modern media often treats exposure as performance, something to be consumed, shared, and forgotten. Spotlight rejects that model entirely. It doesn't want to go viral, it wants to be undeniable. There's a difference. One burns fast, the other burns through layers. Social media thrives on villains and heroes. Spotlight offers neither. Its characters are competent, flawed, patient. Its antagonists are systems, not personalities. That makes the story harder to package and harder to dismiss. Systems don't trend. They persist. Rewatching the film now, the newsroom feels almost utopian, not because it's perfect, but because it values skepticism over certainty. Editors ask uncomfortable questions. Lawyers slow things down. Doubt is treated as responsibility, not weakness. In an era of certainty as branding, that humility feels endangered. The film's relevance deepens when you consider how easily stories today are buried, not through secrecy but through volume. Noise becomes the new cover-up. Spotlight understands that silence isn't the only threat to truth. Distraction is just as effective. The film's focus, its narrow insistence on one story until it breaks, feels almost impossible now. And yet, that's precisely why the film matters. It doesn't romanticize the past, it offers a standard, one that feels difficult, one that feels slow, one that feels necessary. Spotlight isn't nostalgic for old journalism, it's demanding better journalism. From institutions, from professionals, from audiences willing to wait longer for something worth knowing. The movie asks an uncomfortable question. If this story were breaking today, would it survive the cycle long enough to be told properly? Or would it be consumed, reacted to, and replaced before accountability had time to form? That question doesn't accuse, it lingers. Because the film isn't warning about corruption alone, it's warning about impatience. There's a reason Spotlight doesn't soften with time. Most films about institutional failure slowly lose their edge as distance turns outrage into history. This one doesn't. If anything, it grows more uncomfortable. The years don't dull it. They sharpen it. Because the mechanisms it exposes haven't vanished. They've evolved. What still hurts is how recognizable everything feels. The polite deflections. The legal language designed to obscure rather than clarify. The way responsibility diffuses until no one is accountable. These patterns aren't relics of the early 2000s. They're operational habits. Watch the film now and it doesn't feel like a reconstruction. It feels like a template. The discomfort comes from proximity. Spotlight never lets you stand outside the problem. There's no historical framing to create safety. No visual cues that say, this was then. Offices look like offices. Conversations sound like conversations you've heard before. Authority speaks calmly, reasonably, convincingly. That normalcy is what makes the film sting. Evil doesn't arrive announcing itself. It blends in. The movie also refuses to give viewers moral distance. It implicates gently but firmly. The reporters missed the story once. Editors hesitated. Institutions closed ranks. Silence was maintained by people who didn't think of themselves as villains. That's the most unsettling idea the film offers. Harm persists not because of monstrous intent, but because of ordinary compliance. This is why Spotlight resists reclassification as a journalism triumph or a Catholic Church exposé. Those labels shrink it. The film is about how systems protect themselves when challenged, and how difficult it is to disrupt that protection even with facts in hand. That's not a solved problem. That's an ongoing one. The film also hurts because it doesn't reward righteousness. Doing the right thing doesn't make life easier for anyone involved. It complicates it. Relationships strain. Faith fractures. Certainty dissolves. The movie respects that fallout by not resolving it. There's no emotional bookkeeping here. No suggestion that suffering balances out. Even its most procedural scenes carry discomfort. Watching documents reviewed, names repeated, patterns confirmed. It's tedious by design. The tedium is the point. Change doesn't come from dramatic moments. It comes from sustained attention, and sustained attention is exhausting. The film asks you to feel that exhaustion without relief. What's remarkable is how this discomfort becomes the film's endurance mechanism. Because it doesn't aim to please, it doesn't age. It doesn't rely on stylistic trends or emotional shortcuts. Its power comes from clarity, and clarity doesn't expire. Each rewatch removes another layer of safety. You stop asking, how could this happen, and start asking, where is this happening now? The film doesn't answer that question. It leaves it hanging heavy, unresolved. That's why Spotlight still hurts. It doesn't let you off the hook. It doesn't let institutions off the hook. And it doesn't let time do the work of forgiveness. It insists that attention must be renewed, not archived. Pain fades when stories become distant. Spotlight refuses distance. And that refusal is exactly why it lasts. If Spotlight has a final message, it isn't delivered through dialogue or music or even image. It's delivered through absence. The film ends, and nothing rushes in to replace it. No certainty, no reassurance. Just the quiet understanding that attention, once earned, must now be sustained. This is the film's last and most demanding gesture. It doesn't conclude the story. It hands it off. The investigation ends because it must. Journalism has boundaries. It uncovers, verifies, publishes. What happens next belongs to systems larger and slower than any newsroom. Courts, churches, communities, memory. Spotlight understands that truth does not move at the speed of narrative. It moves at the speed of resistance. That's why the final moments feel restrained to the point of severity. The list of cities appears without flourish. No commentary, no judgment, just accumulation. Name after name, place after place. The realization lands with crushing clarity. This wasn't an exception. It was infrastructure. The film's restraint reaches its purest form here. It refuses to frame the revelation as victory or tragedy. It presents it as fact. And facts, once presented, demand something different from us than emotion. They demand responsibility. This is where Spotlight separates itself from most films about truth. It doesn't want your tears. It doesn't want your applause. It wants your vigilance. The movie trusts that if you truly understand what you've seen, your response will not be immediate, but it will be lasting. There is no single image to carry away. No iconic final shot designed for memory. Instead, the film leaves behind a posture, alertness, skepticism. The habit of asking one more question than comfort allows. That posture is its legacy. In a culture obsessed with endings, Spotlight insists on continuation. Institutions do not reform because stories are told. They reform, if they do at all, because attention persists after the story fades from headlines. The film doesn't pretend that persistence is easy. It shows how exhausting it is, how thankless, how incomplete. And yet, it argues, quietly, stubbornly, that this is the work. What makes Spotlight endure isn't that it exposes wrongdoing. Many films do that. It endures because it exposes how wrongdoing survives through fatigue, distraction, politeness, and the human desire to believe things are better than they are. Those forces haven't disappeared. They've multiplied. So the film doesn't ask whether journalism matters. It asks whether we do, whether we are willing to stay with uncomfortable truths after the moment of revelation has passed, whether we will keep looking when looking stops being dramatic. That's the final echo, not a message, but a demand. Attention is not a feeling, it's a practice. And Spotlight leaves you with the unsettling realization that once you've truly seen, the responsibility to keep watching never ends.